Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, head over to iTunes or to Google Play and give us a rating and a comment. In this episode, we're going to talk about elves in your tabletop games. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Brady Berserker.
I'm Big Sexy Brian Bales.
And I'm Metal Matson from Super Geeky Playdate,
A podcast member of the Gonna Geek Network.
Just like the show you're listening to now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual host.
Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
And get ready because geekiness begins in
3, 2,
1.
Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. Couple quick announcements. One, Gen Con badges went on sale yesterday as we're recording this Monday evening. So they are on sale now. They have not sold out, and I hope they really don't, but they are on sale now. So if you are looking to go to Gen Con this year, you should definitely hop on there and sign up and get badges while they are still available because Gen Con is awesome. I guess there's nothing else to say about that. Also, the hotel lottery happens February 14th, 15th, something like that. It's all listed on the website, but tickets are on sale now, so you should definitely sign up and get badges if you plan on attending. And if you sign up, if you get your badges early, they will send them to you in the mail so you don't have to go through a will call, which is kind of a pain. So it's very busy. Although last year...
Depends on when you go.
That's true. And last year, for
Thursday
as busy as it
morning,
was...
a pain.
Well, they really moved through pretty quickly, though. I was very impressed with it. They did a better job this past year than the year before of moving through people pretty quickly. So, all right. Our last announcement is you may have noticed the past couple of weeks things have been a little erratic from us as far as release dates and whatnot. And that is because I am in the process of changing jobs. So I worked a ridiculous amount of hours in the past week or two. And really, I worked the amount of hours that a normal paramedic works with overtime, essentially. So
That's so sad.
I know it is. So yeah, to give you guys an idea, I worked 88 hours in 1 week. And that's not uncommon for a lot of EMS personnel. Now, I don't normally do that, but...
Which is why they die 10 years
This
younger.
is true. This is true. That should be coming to an end. I've got one more weekend to kind of muscle my way through before I go back to Terrible Hote from the sprawling metropolis that is Hoopeston and Danville, Illinois.
Woo, D-Vegas.
Yeah, not really. Not really. But we should be getting back to our normal podcast life and release schedule once things level out a little bit from that. Just wanted to give you guys a heads up because we've been pretty stable really for about a year and a half now and not had much of a hiccup at all, knock on wood somewhere, that we haven't had many problems with maintaining release dates and whatnot. So anyway, you probably heard our vague title today of, what was it? Role-playing elves or elves at your tabletop games or something?
Tabletop RPGs
Okay, so
with elves.
I'm just going to lay out my general feelings about things, I guess. And that is, I like elves in movies, and I like elves in books, and I like elves...
At Christmas time?
I could take or leave them. It's really about Santa. Unless you're talking about like the Will Ferrell elf, and then it's pretty good.
In the Santa mythos, is he really just an elf, or...
He's a guy. He's a cardinal from Turkey that shoved bad people in pickle
Depends
barrels.
on your belief system, I'm just saying.
So I like the way they're portrayed in movies, but when it comes to actually having them at the table, I just generally find them mostly uninteresting. So
I feel like they're kind of like the cop-out race for anybody that just doesn't quite want to play a human.
I think it comes down to I want that dex bonus is what it comes down to, and the night vision, because let's be honest,
it's the night vision.
It's sort of like imagining being a
not
soldier.
Being able to be put to sleep thing is pretty sweet too.
Yeah, it's all right, but imagine being like an army ranger in World War II versus an army ranger with night vision goggles now, and it's pretty significant. Like being able to see in the dark, right? I mean, that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
So I get why you would want to have those
way better than
bonuses.
4 extra skill points.
Yeah. So in my mind, I'm just so you understand where I'm coming from on this. I'm going to kind of lay out my vision of how elves are portrayed in movies and how I would like to see them at the table as well. I would like them to match each other, right? Mm-hmm. So in the Tolkien books that I haven't read, but I have watched them on, in the movies. And this goes to, nearly any fantasy movie is that elves are portrayed as this wise, kind of snobby and
Elitist.
aloof. No, it's aloof.
Aloof sort of is like absent-minded professor. Like,
Okay. But they
what was I doing? I forget. I'm just going to go be over here where you're not.
they have their own, like they're supposed to be separate from humans. It's like the way they act is to portray a very distinct difference between them and humans, right? So they have this, if you think of in the contrast of Elrond and Legolas or Boromir, right? That's a pretty stark contrast between the two.
Legolas is an elf.
Not Legolas. Dang it. Oh my God, it's terrible. Boromir or Aragorn. And
two of them grow much better beards than the other one.
this is true. And Elrond. I couldn't think of his name there for a minute. Like, there's a pretty stark difference between those two, right? The difference between Elrond and Aragorn is still pretty big, but, less than the difference between Elrond and Boromir, right? And when those guys are all in the shot together or they're interacting, or who is the king of the wood elves, Legolas's dad? I can't remember what his name was. But like his is even more so in the Hobbit movies, right? He's even more uncaring towards the world of man and more concerned with elven lives and culture and whatnot. And I really like it that way because it sets up a huge contrast between the two worlds, right? It's like two drastically different worldviews, and neither one of them are necessarily evil, because in fantasy, there's a lot of black versus white morality going on. And I think it's cool to see the elven morality versus the human morality and how different they are, but neither one of them are necessarily evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you agree with that premise that I've laid out there, that that's how they're portrayed and how you see them like on TV or in movies?
So they're elitist, right? That's basically what we've come
elitist,
down on.
aloof,
Ethnocentric.
much wiser. They're generally portrayed as much more intelligent. I think maybe wise is the better word for it because they've just had the wisdom of ages as time goes by.
It is more wisdom, but it's just on account of living longer.
Yeah. So they have much more life experience, but they're also generally smarter because they have this basis of knowledge. And then there's also the mystical component of it that goes along with it too, with they're somehow tied to the creation of the earth, and they have a better connection to the spirit of the earth. And there's this wild magic aspect to it. I don't know if that's the right way to say that or not, but does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So I like that, like I said, when it's on a TV or in a movie or in a book, and I get that feeling.
Do you have like another example that comes to mind for you besides Lord of the Rings? Like, is there...
So I know you haven't watched it yet, but in that Bright movie, which if you haven't watched it, it's on Netflix. It's got Will Smith. It's really good. But all the elves that are in that they drive through Elf Town, and it is...
That is the most ridiculous sounding name.
Elf Town?
Elf Town.
Well, they kind of say it like,
like Chinatown.
Yeah, or Germantown or Rabbit Town or whatever.
Right.
And they go driving through it, and everything is... The sidewalks are super clean, and the cars are all like Mercedes-Benz and Bugattis and all this kind of super nice cars. And everybody's wearing the finest, nicest clothes, the peak of fashion. And it's just very affluent and very snobby, right? And whenever they deal with elves in the show, they just have that feeling to them, this sort of arrogance of you're just beneath me whenever they talk to anybody, whether it's a human or an orc, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, I guess that would be like more of a cyberpunk Shadowrun kind of feel to it. But
can you run a game with like just elves and elven society, and you have like 50-year-old elves that are just like rebelling against their parents and wearing like grunge clothes?
Right. That'd be hilarious. No, I want to wear the flannel. I don't like these
ripped
silks.
Jeans.
These silks are terrible.
Playing music that's off key on purpose.
They stumble so eloquently to prove how unagile they are. Right on.
Sorry, just getting distracted. Sorry.
It's all good. I don't know. Do you need another example? I'm not sure I have one right offhand. Can you think of any other movies or TV shows that have elves that are prominently in it?
No. I don't read fantasy books.
I was just thinking about like TV.
I read that
movies.
one Dragonlance book.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was an elf in there.
Well, that's a good example. In Dragonlance, they very much are that way. like I described, and then there's Tanis, who's half elf, and he kind of straddles this border between the two, but he's definitely more in his personality and how he goes about doing things. He's more on the human side, I would say, is my interpretation of it. But that's how I think most people see elves when they imagine them, right? Now, my problem is when it comes to the actual table and you're playing games, that's not what the average tabletop player, myself included, does when they're playing an elf. They turn into what I feel like is more of a snobby hippie, if there is such a thing. So they're super concerned with the environment and don't burn down the trees and don't kill the animals. And I'm an elf and you're not, and I'm awesome, and elven wine and song is so much better than anything else you're going to do.
So they're like hipsters.
I guess you could say that in a way, maybe. I don't know. But
nature is great, and I only drink this special organic coffee.
But they just
French pressed.
when it comes to actually the role playing of it, it just doesn't come through, and they just feel like,
but like
not quite a human.
Just being like the devil's advocate, right? So like Legolas doesn't really necessarily feel like that either. I feel like it's just because anytime you take an elf away from the rest of the elves, he's not doing what elves are supposed to do. Like there's this argument, like if you're being a good elf, why would you leave the other elves anyway and go on this big adventure? Like clearly you're having some sort of youthful rebellion moment that doesn't make sense in the rest of elven culture because they are so elitist and ethnocentric. Like why would you be hanging out with a dwarf and some humans to begin with?
Okay, I can see that point, but I don't know, I just
Unless you wanted to play a game that was all elves doing elven missions.
Right. Okay. So I agree with what you're saying there.
Like nobody wants to role play a dick 100% of the time.
No one's 100%
at the
a
table. Like these are your friends and colleagues, and it's going to get old like real fast.
Right. But it's not even just about being a turd all the time, right? But okay. So let me back up. I agree with what you're saying in that with Legolas and those kind of characters, because if they are leaving elven society that way, then I agree with you that they're not a classic stereotypical elf. But I could see situations where an elf is forced to leave or forced to go do something, and they would still remain that classic elf archetype.
At least initially.
Oh, yeah. I guess the other piece of it is the way... And this is because we are, after all of us that play role-playing games, as far as I know, and everybody that I've met, are human. So we sort of have this human logic to the way we do things. And essentially, this is where the entire premise of where this came down to for me is that since elves live to be roughly 1,000 years old in most games, and then they and some of them just forever, they don't actually have a natural, like, timely cause of death, they're essentially timeless. So it made me think about vampire games because we play a lot of Vampire the Masquerade, or have in the past. And most of the characters that exist in the Vampire the Masquerade world are 1,000 years old or less. Now, there's a few exceptions to that, all NPCs and whatnot, but the vast majority of who you deal with are in that, several hundred years range, all the way up to 1,000, basically. And it made me think that when you look at the way the World of Darkness works, when the vampires are struggling with some kind of being or whatever, they're timeless. It doesn't matter. So they have this logic of, well, the headache that you're causing me, I'm this timeless being. You just go live your life and do your thing, and I will win because I don't exist in a mortal timeline. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought maybe we should be applying that same logic to elven characters at the table and elven NPCs.
But then, like, even more so, why would they bother to be involved? Then you really do get the Elrond, well, the time of the elves is over. It's time for us to go into the West. And you have 0 elves in your venturing party.
Well, maybe that's what we need, is 0 elves. I don't know.
That's the real argument here. Why are you all playing elves? What?
Well, it's not that, like, I like elves in the game. I don't have a problem with them. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't have elves in your game and you should only have humans or only have humans and dwarves or whatever. I just think your games would be better if there was a bigger contrast between your elves and humans, and then even more so between your elves and dwarves. So, because essentially, to me, it seems like most of the elves at the table, in my mind, when I think about them and the way the games have gone, they seem more like almost like a half elf in that they're humans with pointy ears and some stat bonuses. You know what I mean?
So I'm just wondering then, like, what do you think we should be doing with them? Like, if you see this as a problem, what is your solution to fixing that problem? Like, what would make them more elf-like?
Part of it, I guess, is where obviously the mechanics of how you fight and all that kind of stuff in terms of role-playing game doesn't change, right? But in the moments of role play and decision making and about how you go about solving problems and doing things, I think that it just needs to be a change of mindset in that, like that timelessness thing, I guess is the easiest way for me to, when I thought about this, because when you play a vampire game, right, you really try and get into the mindset of this ageless, timeless creature and how you go about doing things. And functionally, an elf kind of works the same way. You know, they're a creature of magic. They're timeless. You know, they age differently than everyone else. And men live and die their lives in what seems like no time at all for an elf. And I think just having that mindset changes things.
I just don't see how in a regular run-of-the-mill D&D style game that it makes any difference at all.
Well, is that because you think of them as not being extremely story heavy or something, or?
Probably. Yeah, probably.
Okay. So, but there's lots of, like you played, we've played other fantasy games that are not as crunchy or however, dungeon crawly, however you want to say that, and more story focused, right? And like in Fate of Freeport or whatever, do you think that it would be, the games would benefit in those cases where it's more story focused as opposed to more classic D&D style focused game?
I mean, okay, so I guess to me, what I'm seeing is this. Like, one of two things happens. So you have an elf, and he is your stereotypical elf. So then his reason for joining the party would have to be some sort of like hired elf business that for some reason is going to matter to them on their 2,000-year timeline, or he wouldn't be there in the first place. So you have some sort of mega mission that's going to impact the lives of elves everywhere. And so he has to deign to leave his little elfy existence to go run amok with this party of ne'er-do-well lesser beings. Mm-hmm. So he does so. Either that mission is accomplished, and then he goes back to Elf Town and has learned nothing and has evolved not at all and still thinks that he's Supreme Elf number one and has no reason to be running amok with these beings. Right. Or he evolves as a character and becomes, I don't know, more human, I guess, in that he finds them less despicable and somehow enjoyable in company, and therefore thinks that elves are not incredibly superior to all other racial types and becomes a permanent part of their adventuring party, in which case you just have sort of a half-elf sort of creature. So I don't really understand.
Okay, so let me I kind of see what you're saying, because I realize in application it's a little abstracted, I guess. It's a little, I don't know, not necessarily practical, because like you said, I don't want to sit at a table where someone is just role playing a guy who's just a jerk the entire time. That's not fun. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is I don't sense that much of a difference when we've had games with elves at the table. And I would even say dwarves included for the most part, other than the fact that I like to be underground and I have runes and I like access, right? You know, I think that's a different discussion entirely. But what made me think that there was a solution for the elf thing was envisioning them as being these timeless beings in the same way that we do when we play vampire. So think of how, when you play a vampire game, how you interact with mortals. When you have them go do things for you, or...
Like they don't matter at all. Like they're cattle.
Exactly.
Why do you want to role play that with a group of other people that are supposed to be on your team? It's a different style of game, is what I'm saying.
I agree. I don't know. I just thought it would be...
If you want to play like World of Darkness fantasy version, then okay, but I'm kind of intrigued by that idea.
It could be interesting. As I sit here and talk about it, I thought when you said that, you know, the D&D style game, I was like, well, we've done things that were very much a fantasy style game in a World of Darkness mechanics way, just didn't really have elves and dwarves running around or whatever, but it would be very easy for us to do because we're very experienced with that. But I don't know, maybe I think really it just comes back to the fact that whenever we've had those games, I just feel like they sort of fall short when it comes to how the elven characters, or even the elven NPCs are interacting with the party. Now,
So I guess for me, you're talking about some kind of backstory and approaching how you're role playing with a certain amount of thought for this and that. D&D is a mechanical game. If you want to change the way that character is portrayed, then I feel like you have to have some sort of mechanical caveat added on that says
yeah.
you get some sort of, like a virtue vice sort of thing.
Well, yeah, there's a button you can push that encourages you to act that way.
Right.
That would reward you. I agree.
So do you have some sort of mechanical fix in mind that forces elven players to act more like elves?
I don't think so. And not without changing things a whole lot. And I think you would have to have, if you did that, you would have to have some way to do that for dwarves, and another way for humans, to where it would reinforce everybody acting a certain way. Now, as we talk about it, Burning Wheel has something similar to that, because they have, elves have another statistic that humans don't, that's called sorrow, I believe. And it's a statistic that's rated from, I think, 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. I can't remember. It's been too long since I've looked at it. And dwarves have one called greed. And if you're a human and you're like a cleric and have magic powers that way, then you have faith. And it's to draw a difference between, you have this additional thing that affects every decision that you make. Now, the one for elves is called sorrow, because the world, because of the way technology has progressed and the wars of man, they know what the world used to be. And there's this sorrow that goes along with them, and that in the implied setting of Burning Wheel, that your level of sorrow can increase, and as it gets too high, then you can kind of become an evil elf, essentially like a dark elf, right? And it's something on the page that says this is always there to remind you and affect you. And dwarves have this thing for greed, and they can go up and possibly down. I think you can reduce it. It's really hard to do with most of those kind of statistics. And then the human side has faith, and I would even argue that makes sense as well, because if you have strong enough faith in something to give you the power to create miracles, you're not a regular human being anymore. You're like a category onto yourself, right? And I think if you have those pieces, now that's in Burning Wheel, but if you have that in mind, the concept is the same no matter what system you're playing in. It's just more of it makes you think about things differently. And then when you're in a different headspace, when you play a character, different choices are made, and you role play differently, and that character comes to life in a different way at the table.
Right.
So does that make more sense saying it that way?
Yeah. I think the mechanical aspect is important in that style of game, is all that I'm saying. Even if it's just something simple, like to stick with the vampire thing. So your clans in vampire all have their own unique virtue and vice. So you could do a very similar thing with races. So, like, your Sabisi are very tied to home, which sort of is reminiscent to me of the elves.
Right.
Yeah, so they have to either return to their home soil, or they have to somehow carry a portion of it with them. You could have a similar sort of, or like a you have to commune with nature, whatever, once a day, or you take some sort of like noticeable penalty for not being connected to your inner elfiness.
As we sit here and talk about this, I wonder.
Or dwarves could have like the opposite of claustrophobia and start to freak out for a while if they're in too open of a space.
Do you think maybe this happens because you make a human fighter, right? And you make him up, and essentially human's a part of your character, but the largest part in those style games is fighter, because that's your class, and that dictates the abilities that you get and the kind of character you make, right? Now, if I make elven fighter, essentially there's only one small piece on my character sheet that is different than your human fighter. Now, granted, as time goes by and I have this dex bonus and whatever, it can kind of, at the beginning it's pretty big, but I think as the characters go along and advance, that difference becomes smaller and smaller, right? Mm-hmm. So do you think that maybe it doesn't get portrayed the same way because functionally, when it comes down to the rules of the game, the difference between a 5th level fighter, elf, and a 5th level human fighter isn't that much?
Absolutely.
So then do you think, along with that same lines, in Lamentations of the Flame Princess, all of the non-human races have their own class? So do you think that because I'm playing an elf and I'm a 3rd level elf in Lamentations, that makes me would that make you play that character differently than like a specialist or a cleric or a fighter?
Yes.
All right.
Because it's a completely different thing then. It's not, well, like you said, like the focus is more on fighter. Like it's all about what skills you possess, and that's informed much more by your class than it is by your race. It's as much of an afterthought as your deity or your alignment.
Right. I really thought the vampire thing was an interesting way to look at this, but as we talk about it, I realize it's much more than that. I don't know. I think you're right with the mechanics of it though, because in a D&D style game, that is the piece that you interact with the most. Not saying that you can't have a story focused game playing D&D, but when it comes to the buttons that you're going to push to get experience and to get rewards, that's not part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. I hadn't considered that at all. Well, maybe that is the solution then. Maybe if because you could have that mindset change at the table, right? No matter what game you're playing.
As usual, we sat down and arrived at the conclusion that if that's what you want, you should play something other than D&D.
That's terrible.
Maybe that's not that. That's the conclusion I arrived at.
Well, I don't know. I think that you could do it in D&D, and I think your D&D games would be better, and it would seem a bigger difference between humans and elves and dwarves. And I think that, like, we're focusing a lot on the players' characters, right? But in reality, you're probably going to interact with more NPC elves than you are PC elves. In terms of running games, maybe it's a bigger and more important piece for the people running the games, the game masters and dungeon masters and storytellers and whatever you want to call it, whatever acronym that you choose to use. It's more on them to make sure that when they are portraying these elves and dwarves and whatnot, that they are making sure that they are putting themselves into a much different headspace for when they lay out different decisions and reactions and what they want to do and how they interact with the players.
That sounds fair. I think maybe I don't know, this is just an idea, but one other way to kind of approach it that would set it apart, normally we recommend creating characters together in a group, but if you created characters in groups based on race, if you just segregated everyone at the table, you know what I mean? So if I have a couple of people that are playing elves, they kind of hash out their characters and backstory together, and then maybe even give them almost like a fate, kind of describe some of your adventures up to this point. Or if you can't get everybody together at the table at one time, you could have an individual session with one or two players that involves just elves or just dwarves or just humans. So they have more of a foundation of being that type of character.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're kind of initially fleshing things out and
way.
Then you bring them together as they still have a reason to be together as a group. Right.
When they come together.
Yeah. You see what I'm saying?
That could be very cool. I think that would be a good way to set the tone. Although I think as you played, and if it was a long running game, that would get small, that difference would get smaller and smaller as the game went on without a lot of work. But
Which seems like it should, because it's like I said, you either go back to the elves and you remain a stuck-up elf, or you stay with the mixed party and you become some sort of open-minded half-elf freak sort of thing.
It just seems like if you're 150, think of your grandparents, right? And how slow they are to change their minds about things sometimes, right? In the same way that I think an elf that's 150 or 200 years old is going to be slow to change their mind about things as well. So I'm not saying it wouldn't happen. And obviously you could portray your character however you wanted to, but I think it would take a longer time for that to happen. And I think the easiest way to portray that is to have one of those sessions, if you can, with just the elven characters again, like you did before, and have a little couple scenes or a session or whatever you can do to remind them of their elfiness, or however you want to phrase that or whatever. And then that would sort of keep that fresh in the players' minds of what it is that we're elves and we are different than humans and that we're living in the world of men and blah, 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 whatever, right?
Right.
Well, cool. I guess my vampire analogy was kind of relevant, but almost entirely not. So, right on. I don't know. It was kind of cool. I just thought it was a cool idea, and I think it would improve people's games at the table, like a real actual thing to use at your table that could change things in a kind of a interesting way. And I don't know. It's something that I realized that we had done, and myself, the NPCs that I have played. I may have had some hoity-toity elves that were turds, but for the most part, they were just snobby humans, if we're going to be honest about it. They weren't. There wasn't that big of a distinction between the two.
They're the Toreador of fantasy classes.
There you go. There you go.
Fantasy races, I guess I should say.
Right on. Well, do you have anything else to say about portraying elves better at the tabletop?
I don't know. I don't know if I was at all helpful in this.
No, I totally think you were, because a lot of the things that you said are totally relevant that I hadn't even considered.
I don't know. I don't think I have anything else. Like, the frame of mind shift is good, but I think like there has to be more than that. It's not enough.
Fair enough. Right on. Well, you guys know that we are members of the Gonna Geek Network, so quick plug for the Super Geeky Playdate, episode number 65, top 5 of 2017. It's going to be a mix of The Wizard of Oz and Santa Claus, where there must always be a Guy Fieri.
I'm not sure that went together in my brain at all.
No, It
was like a hard shift.
That's some elven logic there. That's what that is. Right on. So check them out. That's the Super Geeky Playdate, and you can find them at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. Well, that'll do it for us this week. If you guys have any cool ways that you have found to improve the way that elves or other non-human races were portrayed at your table, drop us a line and let us know what worked for you. You can hit us up on Twitter, or you can email me at james@justonemorefix. You can support us by going to our Patreon and supporting us there at patreon.com/justonemorefix. You can get raw episode feeds there, and where you can find
bonus content,
early access to our actual plays that we have a couple in the bag that we're in the process of editing now. But those, as it turns out, take quite a bit more time to edit. That kind of sucks.
Don't tell them what's there. They gotta go to the site and find out.
Oh, that's true. Nah. There's
like
pre and post shows
present.
and raw audio feeds.
Did you just say raw audio feeds?
No, I think I just said raw audio feeds. I don't know.
I like it. Raw audio feed. Excellent.
So check us out there at patreon.com/justonemorefix. You can also support us by following us on Twitter at justonemorefix. And as always, we will see you guys next week. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetent.com. You can find us at justonemorefix.com and follow us on Twitter at justonemorefix.